Stormborn by Black K. Cat. Chapter 27, Fourth Movement. Corante for a new conflict. Corante, literally running. A piece of music written in triple time. Also a fast-paced dance from the Baroque period. You know, I'm starting to get this weird suspicion that we got the short end of the stick here. Ignoring Fu with the ease of long practice, Gara calls up a wall of sand to block a missile from the Asura path, drops and rolls to avoid a blow from one of the animal path's summit, and buries the human path with a wave of one hand. The diva path darts in just this side of Too Fast to See, and Gara is forced to meet him hand to hand, even though he knows the dangers of it. Half a moment later, though, there's an explosion edged with glittering silver, and Gara leaps away from him to land in front of Kakashi and the masked Anbu, calling up a cocoon of sand to save their eyes as Fu blinds all six paths with her scale powder bomb. Kakashi doesn't pause to thank him, but is already moving even as the sand falls away, a lightning technique forming around his hand. Tenzo flanks him as he lunges for that Naraka path, the Anbu aiming for the animal path as sharp-tipped roots explode from the ground. Fu swoops in above them, Chiyomi's chakra gathering around her, and Gara spares her half a glance. Mostly unharmed, chakra reserve still holding out well enough. But he turns his attention to the Preta path and swallows him in a coffin of sand. Gara doesn't like fighting like this. His usual tactic of planting his feet and simply manipulating his sand won't work here, and is far closer to ritual suicide than any sort of smart strategy. Now he has to duck and dodge and weave to stay out of the way of the diva path's gravity, which is something even his armor of sand can't withstand. Gritting his teeth, he shoves at Shukaku in his head, and the Tanuki snarls in return, but reluctantly increases his chakra until Gara can spread it all the way across their battlefield. Fu! He calls, and half a second later, another flare of light blinds the paths. In the same instant, Gara clenches a fist and wraps all six paths in a thick, bijou-augmented coffin of sand. He has no illusions about how long it will hold him, but at this point, any chance to plan an actual, functional strategy is more than welcome. He isn't Naruto, who could throw himself into a knot of enemies with no plan whatsoever, trick them 10 times in a row, and emerge victorious. Gara likes to plan, and while he can definitely do it on the fly, against opponents like these, he can't risk anything resembling a flaw. You think to hold us like this? The Diva Path asks, voice only just barely audible from within the meter-thick sand. This is base foolishness, Ichibi Jinchuriki. Your sand is nothing more than a child's toy against me. Shikaku huffs in offense at that, and Gara will never admit it, but he feels similarly. Narrowing his eyes at the 6 human-sized mounds, he adds another few feet of thickness to their coffins, reinforces the Asura paths, again just for good measure, and then heads for where Kakashi and Tenzu are falling back. Fu drops down to join them, folding her wings along the line of her spine as she lands. Her expression is far from happy, but Gara is relieved to see that she doesn't bear more than superficial wounds, despite having focused on the animal path and its summons. She meets his eyes as he studies her, and her smile is quick and brief, but warm with reassurance, and a heartbeat later she plants her hands on her hips and says, "So, Commander? Plan? As much as I love head-on confrontations, this isn't working." Gara closes his eyes, keeping half of his attention on the contained paths, but letting the rest adrift. The danger is in their teamwork, he murmurs to himself more than his companions. As extensions of the same will, they can operate flawlessly together, while we are only human. They have a shared line of sight, don't they? Asks Kakashi, sounding thoughtful. What should be blind spots aren't blind spots at all. Fu makes a disgusted noise. The Rinnegan, she confirms. Nagato divided his powers into 6 bodies that he controls from a distance. They might as well be one person with a Hyuga's range of vision. At that moment, 3 of the 6 coffins explode outward, and Tenzo lunges past Gara's nose in a blur of steel and reaching branches. Kakashi follows him in earth technique, swallowing the Asura path as he kicks the animal path into the path of Tenzo's next jutsu. Gara sends his sand with them to make the footing treacherous for the enemy, but when Fu moves to launch herself into the air again, he catches her by the arm. From a distance, he thinks, like an epiphany. Dojutsus generally require line of sight, he says, or at least proximity, because they've been working together for 6 years now, in everything from rebuilding houses to commanding a village to training their Ganin teams. Fu gets what he's saying without any more need for clarification. She grins, bright and fierce, and nods. Those 2 will need to hold them off, she says. You can make the seal? Gara nods, already reaching out with his hand to carve the lines of the seal into the earth around the battlefield. You have the chakra? He countered, and she rolls her eyes and doesn't bother to answer, flinging herself up into the air. White Rock? She calls back even as she flips over to kick the human path away from where it's coming up behind Denzo. That should be sufficiently far away, Gara judges, ducking away as the diva path closes in on him. He catches a blow before it can reach his head and then ducks down and forward to throw the first path over his shoulder. The diva path lands on his feet, but that half a second of delay is enough for Gara to call up more of his sand and bury the reanimated corpse in a wave of it. The edges catch the Naraka path, pulling him along, and Gara heads for where Kakashi is hemmed in by a giant ox, a vast centipede, and a huge dog with multiple heads. He sweeps Naruto's former teacher out of the way just as the dog lunges, letting it crash into the ox, and his sand carries them to the far side of the battlefield. I don't suppose you have any summons? Gara asks without much hope, blocking a blow from the Preta path with a wall that holds it back and then surges forward to trap it. Does the cute mouthy little pug count? Kakashi asks dryly, knocking one of the Asura path's blades away with a kunai and then following up with a surge of flames. Gara doesn't bother to answer that, but spares half a moment to wish that Orochimaru would conveniently show up right about now. Manda might be aggressive, violent, and rude, but he's plenty big enough to eat these summons and would likely be more than happy to do so. The diva path strikes at him again, too fast for a human, but at that moment the last line of the seal connects and Gara smiles. Just faintly, but it's enough to make the path's eyes narrow as it pulls up short. You, it begins, but Gara doesn't give him time to finish. Ow! He calls, and she laughs, flipping over in midair and folding her wings, dropping into a crouch on the edge of the open space. The Preta and animal paths lunge for her, hands reaching, but she doesn't move, and Denzo blocks them with a wall of wood. Fu swipes at one of the bleeding cuts on her arm, covering her hand with blood, and slams her palm down on the outermost of the deep lines Gara's sand carved into the ground. The hum of her chakra fills the air, the sound of beetle wings on a warm summer night, and light races over the sea like caged lightning. Gara feels the world shift and slide away, and it feels like victory. There's a tight, tense pounding behind Sakura's eyes, the beginning of what will be a truly spectacular migraine if she pays attention to it, so she shuts it away, focuses on the barely controlled chaos in front of her instead. Kage, Fujimoto, take your squads to the western edge of the battlefield. Akagi, Tachibana in the south. Find a Chunin to guard you. We'll go. The soft voice makes her start and turn, glancing down to see 12 children with Uzushio Hitayate standing in the hastily erected medical center. A pair of redheads are in the front, watching her with resolve like iron in their violet eyes. But the one who spoke is a smaller boy, blonde and amber-eyed, who's standing just to their left. Sorry? She asks after a beat, glancing from the blonde boy to the others behind him. There isn't a single one over 14, and she's willing to bet they're still Genin. But 3 Genin together and on the verge of their Chunin exam is well equal to most Chunin, and hopefully these 12 are the same, if they're volunteering for what she thinks. And as though in response to the thought, the red-headed girl in the front raises her chin, as if it's a challenge. Uzukage-sama sent us, she says. We can accompany your medic teams instead of a Chunin. Sakura is a shinobi. She's been one, or been in training to be one, for the vast majority of her life. And so she doesn't hesitate. All right, she answers, shoving herself back into a commander's mindset by sheer force of will. Fighting is heaviest on the western edge, so the most proficient in combat will be needed there. The southern quadrant is the furthest from here, so prioritize speed. You know your own capabilities, so I'll leave that to you. The girl nods sharply and turns to survey her fellow Genin for a long heartbeat. Then she takes a breath and orders, Team Fu, you'll be with us. Team Koto, Team Gin, you're fastest here. So south. Ready? There's a low murmur of agreement, and the teams look back at Sakura expectantly. No grandstanding, no arguing, no petty displays of one-upmanship or battles of will regarding the girl's command. Sakura feels a faint pang for her own Genin classmate, who likely wouldn't have accepted such orders without at least a token fight. Right, she says after a second, and gestures to where Fujimoto and Kage are waiting impatiently. Fighters, those are your squads. Move out. We've got lives to save. The 2 redheads and the blonde boy follow Kage as she darts away, falling in around the 3 medics without pause. The other team, 2 girls and another red-headed boy, follow Fujimoto's squad as the others break for the south, and Sakura closes her eyes with a brief, undirected prayer that they'll all come back. Then they get another flood of wounded shinobi, and she doesn't have any more time to think. Utakata is cursing quietly under his breath, nursing a ragged burn that stretches from his shoulder all the way to his fingertips. Saiken is already healing it, and he can feel the soothing wash of chakra sliding beneath the blackened skin, but it's not quite fast enough. Conan is ruthless and relentless, fully deserving of her S-rank status, and her paper attacks aren't even slightly susceptible to water, which is Utakata's affinity. He's getting beaten by paper. Utakata is greatly offended by this. Conan releases a flight of paper shuriken, but light flashes off something hair-thin and metallic as Goto darts in front of him. Wires follow the arc of her fingertips, and a small touch of chakra brings them to life with a bone-shaking hum of sound. The noise rises, sharpens as the projectiles near, and just before they strike and hits its peak, the paper shreds as if ripped by an invisible hand, and Goto lunges forward, her wires lashing out at Conan directly. A surge of paper sheets blocks them, knocking them off course, and before Goto can recover, Conan sends her origami weapons shooting after her. The gray-haired woman swears and throws herself out of the way, but the paper follows, and she abandons her wires in favor of a whirling vortex of water that hurls the kunai to one side. As the feeling returns to his fingertips, Utakata flexes his hand and lifts his head to fix his stare on Conan. The woman steps back, expressionless and seemingly perfectly calm, and Utakata has to bite his tongue to keep from cursing again. He doesn't envy the others facing pain at Madara, but he doesn't particularly care for this match either. I don't suppose you would consider surrendering? He asks, because he might as well, and because Naruto is infectious in the same way as a particularly contagious disease. Conan doesn't react either way, though, and he sighs softly, giving up on that line of thought. He doesn't have Naruto's skill with words, won't be able to convince her even if he wanted to take the time to try. Overwhelming her will have to suffice. So again? He asks, silently, and the Biju answers eagerly, its power rising in a wave. Utakata closes his eyes and lets the transformation take him as he surrenders control to the Rokubi. Saiken doesn't shut him out, doesn't attempt to run rampant with the freedom, and Utakata is once more grateful to Killer B and his training. The Six Tails has always been reasonable, seemingly far more so than the other Biju besides Yuki, but to have him as a full ever-reliable partner is more than he had ever imagined before meeting the Kage's brother. Conan realizes what's happening just half a heartbeat too late. A cloud of exploding tags fly across the field, but Saiken breathes out a fog of gaseous acid that dissolves them on contact. Eyes narrowing, the blue-haired woman leaps back, hands coming up to form signs, but Saiken doesn't wait for her to finish. A wave of sticky slime swamps her, and Conan cries out, seemingly despite herself, as the goo sticks her in place, binding her papers before they can fly. With a crow of victory, Saiken asks, "That all you wanted, Bubbles?" Utakata chuckles softly, letting Saiken fade back into his mindscape again. "Thank you," he responds, letting the cheerful, energetic Biju feel his fondness. He could argue the nickname, and all that does. But for now, he'll let it go. Naruto was right to pick us to face her. I forgot I shouldn't doubt him. Don't tell Kurama that, Saiken mutters, somewhat waspishly. I get enough grief from him as it is. Hardly made of glass. Personally, no matter how fond of Kabuto he may be, Utakata wouldn't even dream of calling him cute. But he supposes that as the Ookami matriarch, Goto is allowed. It's still rather horrifying, though. He resolutely puts it out of mind, recorking the bottle of bubble solution and tugging it back into his robes. Kabuto designed it, yes. He agrees, withdrawing his regular solution. It's fairly unwieldy for anything but surprise attacks, and it's fairly unwieldy for anything but surprise attacks, as it's slower than the rest of my jutsus, but still useful. The remaining bubbles sweep out, striking several nearby white Zetsu and rendering them senseless as well. I sense my cute little cousin's hand in that, Koto says from off to the side, wrapping a cut on her thigh. Utakata studies her with narrowed eyes, and she waves him off with a huff. Oh, stop fretting, I'm hardly made of glass. Personally, no matter how fond of Kabuto he may be, Utakata wouldn't even dream of calling him cute. But he supposes that as the Ookami matriarch, Koto is allowed. It's still rather horrifying, though. He resolutely puts it out of mind, recorking the bottle of bubble solution and tugging it back into his robes. Kabuto designed it, yes. He agrees, withdrawing his regular solution.
It's fairly unwieldy for anything but surprise attacks, as it's slower than the rest of my jutsus, but still useful.
Koto chuckles at that, rising to her feet and uncoiling her wires again. The fighting is thick around them, already moving into the space that was originally clear for their battle. And she almost casually flicks a hand, wrapping the wires around a pair of white zetsu ganging up on a dark-haired Junin. A throbbing hum of power and the high sweet sound rips them apart, and she moves on to the next cluster with a wicked grin. She's definitely related to Kabuto, Utakata thinks with a sigh. He raises his pipe to his lips and breathes out a string of ink-filled bubbles, then lets them fly. For all that she hasn't actually fought since facing Orochimaru 7 years ago, Tsunade hasn't let herself get rusty. She's a Kage, her village's last line of defense, the one to join the battle when everything looks hopeless. If she's not in top form, that kind of duty might as well be a death sentence. So she's kept up her training, even as she's prayed she'll never need to use it. She's using it now, though, and without hesitation, because these green freaks are closing in on her village, on her people, and she's not the type to let that stand. As with Danzo, she's following her own beliefs, leading the charge when she should technically hold back and let her shinobi fight for her. Then again, she's not the only one Tsunade thinks Riley, ducking as a knot of white zetsu go flying over her head, hurled by the powerful blow of a huge battle fan. Mei is off to the left, molten rock surging like a tide around her. The other Kage are in the very heart of the fray, and they don't look to be leaving anytime soon. A hard punch slams the clone in front of Tsunade to the ground, leaving it unmoving, and she forges ahead, laying around her the way she hasn't since the end of the second war. A clone slams into her bodily, knocking her off balance, and she curses sharply as she tumbles to the ground. Fighting masses of enemies is both easier and harder than fighting a single opponent, and she's out of practice in this at least after so many years. Back in the war, she had... Hey, mate! Jiraiya plows into a group of clones, laying them out with several blindingly quick blows, even as a surge of chakra, familiar and dear, untouched by the abrasive, almost mad edge it had the last time she felt it, rises on her other side. Orochimaru hisses out a jutsu, hands dancing through the sides, and blades of wind tear across the battlefield, carving deep furrows in the ground and bloody gashes into enemy flesh. Tsunade, he acknowledges, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye the way he always used to do when he was nervous or uncertain of his welcome, and Tsunade has to choke back a sob of relief to see them both here, alive and unharmed. The lack of word the last few days alarmed her more than she cares to admit. Jiraiya, Orochimaru. She breathes and reaches out automatically. Jiraiya falls back from his downed opponents, catching her hand with a bright, cheerful grin and squeezing gently. Orochimaru hesitates, watching her carefully, but he too offers her hand, and when she takes it, some of the lines around his eyes ease faintly. He makes no further gestures, but together they pull her to her feet. Once she's standing, he meets her eyes squarely. Tsunade, he says softly, I am... sorry. Tsunade's breath catches in her throat because she knows Orochimaru, knows him inside and out and in all the ways he hides himself with words or otherwise, knows that he never apologizes unless he actually means it, unless his deeply buried heart won't let him to otherwise. Equally, she knows that it isn't a simple thing, those words said here and now. Familiar scars present beneath her fingers even though they should have been lost with his original body. The apology is for everything, all the way back to the beginning. From pulling away from them, to the experiments, to Sarutobi, to their encounter 7 years ago, and Tsunade. She hadn't realized just how much she wanted to hear it until he spoke. Tightening her grip on his hand, she releases Jiraiya and pulls her lost teammate close, wraps her arm around his thin shoulders, and hugs him tightly. He stiffens and her hold tense and still like a wary snake. But after a long moment, he reaches up and gently pats her shoulder. It's an awkward motion, unpracticed and stiff, but it makes her laugh a little anyways, because that's to be entirely expected. He's always been that way. You idiots, she says thickly, letting him go and taking a step back to wipe her eyes. Too many reunions in the last hour, too much stress. She's not normally this emotional. You two had better have a good excuse for making me worry so much. Jiraiya laughs, and there's real joy in it because she said the same thing so very many times before in their Genin days after missions and the war. He slings an arm over each of their shoulders, tugging them into crushing half-hugs, and then lets them go to crack his knuckles. Hey, Hime, we've got a bit going, he tells her cheerfully. You want in? Tsunade glances between them, standing so tall and solid in front of her, and can't help the surge of warmth that fills her chest. Nothing is perfect. There are still old grievances, still old grieve, crimes, and distance, and 3 decades of separation, but for now this is enough. Usual odds? She asks, wiping her eyes one last time and shaking the tension out of her fingers. Of course, Orochimaru answers, arching an amused brow at her. You really think we play for other stakes at this point, Tsunade? Huffing out a determined breath, Tsunade plants her hands on her hips and turns to survey the army before them. Prepare to lose, boys, she tells them and doesn't fight her smile. It falls away, however, when a familiar figure in red armor plunges past her, laughing merrily as he goes, and a giant dragon of wood erupts around him. Tsunade blinks at her grandfather's retreating figure as it's all but buried by white Zetsu clubs. She glances toward Orochimaru, who is always at fault where weird happenings are concerned, and is promptly struck speechless by the man stalking past him. Witless, idiotic clown! Senju Tobirama mutters before following his brother. Surprised? Jiraiya offers weakly, and Tsunade growls.